To welcome to our virtual platform is Geertje, who's dialing in also from Dublin here today, although that's not where you're originally from, is it, Geertje? Geertje and myself, we've been working together very, very closely over the last few years, and I personally have learnt a huge amount from the wonderful Geertje. And so Geertje is going to speak to us about interdisciplinary from a social science perspective. Over to you, Geertje.
Thanks very much, Sarah. So yes, I'm Dutch by birth. I am a psychologist by training. I currently work in the School of Business in Dublin, and I'm a principal investigator in the Research Ireland Centre for Applied Geosciences. So for this talk, I promised Sarah and team to take the social science perspective and talk a little bit about the integration of social sciences, collaboration in all sorts of projects. And talk about sort of projects. Lots of projects look at certain elements of the world. When we talk about raw earth materials, well, how can we use them for the energy transition? What's the implication for climate change? How do we use energy? How does it work with the use of materials to build technologies and infrastructure? All these type of projects, all these type of challenges, we tend to try and combine very often natural sciences with social sciences. And natural sciences, broad sense of the world, tend to look at the world and focus on the physical aspects, the rock, the energy, the water, CO2, so all sorts of physical elements, whereas social sciences look at the people, social structure, cultural aspects of the world. And so I have been, since my training, involved in interdisciplinary projects where we try to somehow combine the collaboration between natural scientists and social scientists. And I've seen lots of things go wrong. I've seen lots of barriers being raised. And part of that reason why that happens is because natural scientists and social scientists use a different lens to look at the world. To start with, we look at different elements. So if you focus on physical aspects, you may not look always at the human or cultural components that are also part of it. And vice versa. In social sciences, we tend to focus on these more cultural and social aspects and ignore, to a certain extent, the physical reality. So by looking at these problems, looking at these challenges, we use a different lens. And that, I think, is essential to remember when we're actually trying to collaborate. So that collaboration we would call interdisciplinarity. And I thought I'd put up a definition, as scientists do, as social scientists do. So interdisciplinarity is creating new knowledge, is advancing knowledge, is coming up with something new because we combine the knowledge of different disciplines. Now that's different from something like multidisciplinarity, which typically means that different disciplines will work together, but don't really have that synthesis, don't really try and generate something new, but they combine the different perspectives. Then I know that earlier today and yesterday also, there are loads of great talks about transdisciplinarity. And that is a combination of academic and non-academic stakeholders who holistically combine all their knowledge together. So it's a much wider system way of thinking on collaboration. So I'm going to focus on interdisciplinarity, but the other elements are also relevant. I put on here an example of, I think, really successful interdisciplinary collaboration. That is the documentary that both Sarah and I made, filmed 6 weeks or something ago, and it will be launched today in 90 minutes or so. There's going to be a live watch along. I'm sure someone can put in the chat a link if you're interested in watching it. And for all those in the room, if you will watch this documentary, keep in mind that this is a collaboration. between social sciences and geosciences, and I think very successful, because without each other, we would not have been able to come up with this fantastic product. And yes, we also needed the arts in this, because the creative team behind it is another essential contribution to make this product what it is. So it's not just social science and geosciences in this case, but the whole team together, I believe they're talking later today, helped produce this novel new product. So why can it be so difficult then to generate interdisciplinary research? Because from everyone in the room, and we're discussing collaborations, we also know it can be quite challenging to actually make this work, to produce novel outputs if you put different disciplines together. Now, on your right-hand side, you see a very good overview of a recent paper that actually analyzes the different levels at which there are barriers, but also opportunities to create success for interdisciplinary research. And it ranges from the top level, where we're looking at individual elements, things like motivation, interest, positive mindset, to very high level, institutional level, socio-political level, where research funding, rewards, assessments, that sort of institutional elements can drive or hinder successful interdisciplinary collaboration. Now, what I think is that actually looking at the middle level could be a very good starting point to build success for interdisciplinary research. I think this is important because it can spill over to both the individual level and mitigate against institutional level. So with that meso level or middle level, I'm thinking about research projects like Horizon Europe projects, or thinking about, I am working in the Research Center for Applied Geosciences, which is a research center that combines and focuses on interdisciplinary research. So think of that middle level, that program level. You can actually try and build something called a research culture that supports interdisciplinarity. And if you have a research culture that promotes interdisciplinarity, I think you can actually attract motivated, interested individuals, and to a certain extent overcome these barriers. Like, I'm interested in this, but where do I find a home? But you might also be able to mitigate against these institutional barriers. You can have institutional, like on your group level, rewards. You can sometimes divide funding differently. So you might be able to somehow mitigate against these institutional barriers. So I'm here focusing on a research culture on a group level. Now, why is that important, and what should that research culture focus on? And in my head, and I've been thinking about this since Sarah and I started working on this project that the documentary is a result of, I think some of the disbalances that currently exist in how natural and social sciences are perceived need to be overcome in this research culture. And I'm going to give you a list of how the world scientists, social scientists, natural scientists look at these different disciplines and give it some thought. And I'm not saying this is explicit, always clearly articulated differences, but these are differences that are a little bit under the surface. So first of all, natural sciences tend to be called hard sciences, and social sciences are called soft sciences. There's already a little bit difference in what that means. Now, these are quotes, so I put them between quotation marks. People have suggested that natural sciences are difficult, durable, and strong because it's a lot of mathematics, lots of numbers. And once we have a result, and once we have a model and calculated it, we have a final outcome. As opposed to social sciences, which are then defined sometimes as easy, malleable, and weak. And that's because it's difficult to assess human behavior or values or norms. What does it mean? And we change our minds quite a bit. And so sometimes this comes across as soft and weak. Now, natural sciences, especially in these collaborations, tend to lean towards impact-driven research. They'll focus on creating concrete hard output, something that industry, policymakers, stakeholders can use. Now, the social sciences have a tendency to lean towards theory-driven research. We want to advance knowledge. We want to think about what it all means. And so sometimes the perceptions of how much impact can be delivered by these two different types of sciences is often seen as strong and important when we talk about natural sciences, or weak and sometimes trivial if we're talking about social sciences. Now, I wanted to put in the word plurality here, and I think I'm not saying that there's different levels of plurality in the different sort of elements, but I do think that plurality, meaning what do things mean? How can we measure it? How should we look at things? Is way more part of the scientific debate in social sciences compared to natural sciences. And let me give you an example. Pretty sure that in geosciences, a rock is a rock. And you can measure how much copper is in, I can see Sarah hinting here, may not be true. Pretty sure you can measure the minerals in that rock. And yes, you may have a debate, is rock a rock? You may have a debate, how much copper is in that rock and how can we measure it properly? But my sense is that in social sciences, these type of debates, is a rock, or is a value, is way stronger and way more prominent in social sciences. So if any one of you have been in a room with social scientists discussing science, you can have very long discussions whether we should use the word people or peoples. Should we say value or values? And so the level of debate of what do we mean, what is knowledge, how do we measure it, I think is way more to the foreground in social sciences than in natural sciences. And this can be, yes, it could be a hindrance of collaboration among social sciences, but it can also hinder the collaboration between natural sciences and social sciences. We'll come back to that. And the last point I'd like to make is that, and I don't have the data behind it, but my intuition is that usually these bigger projects looking at concrete challenges around raw materials, climate change, energy, tend to be led by the natural sciences and not so often by the social sciences. So all these differences, I think, can hinder the collaboration between the two types of sciences. Now, and I know I'm running out of time, just a few thoughts of how might we build that research culture and what should we focus on. So I'll go beyond the things that I am pretty sure have been mentioned, things like respect and communication, building trust, listening to each other, manage expectations, take differences into consideration. I'm sure it's been mentioned, but from this social science perspective, I think we have to rethink that implicit status difference, to think about social sciences as weak versus strong natural sciences, or soft and hard. It doesn't help the collaboration if it's not seen as equal. And I think what it requires is early exposure to a broad view of different disciplines in training, in programs, but also when you start a project, put effort and time in to talk to each other, to actually understand the status differences. I talked about that pluralism. I think we should embrace it, use it to your advantage. And I think there's lots of things to say in this, but I'll keep it short. And I think the core there is if someone takes a different perspective, puts in an idea, we should use it to trigger curiosity any research is way too often driven by external factors, trying to get a reward, trying to get an output. But if you want to capture social scientists to the core, you have to work on that curiosity. And I think from curiosity, you get fantastic results that you may not have thought about when you started the collaboration. And I would say that documentary is a great example of that curiosity-based product. So give it a try. Lastly, and then I'll hand over to Sarah, I think social sciences should co-own and take more leadership over projects that are about humans' social and cultural structures. I think what very often happens is that if they don't lead projects, they don't really get to put their own angle on the problems. So from my experience, you sometimes get a natural scientist who brings up a really important, complex issue. Why does this community not accept this type of technology? And then the answer is implicit built in that question. Oh, we got to talk about the benefits. Now, any social scientist would say it's not that easy. It's way more nuanced. So let them run with the challenge. Let them take ownership over the projects so that they can actually work on that curiosity and build on the ownership of that project. So I think we should work towards a better balance in who leads projects. And with that, Sarah, I hand back to you.
Thank you very, very much, Geertje. As always, absolutely fantastic. Round of applause, everybody, for Geertje. Thank you very much. Geertje, we're going to invite everybody else kind of into this discussion now. But one question for you before we open it up to our other wonderful panelists to share their thoughts and their reflections from what we've heard over the last few hours. Geertje, in terms of impact, so you had that, of course, in the natural sciences, very often saying it's impact driven. What are we trying to achieve here in terms of that change, etc. And that being actually quite a difficult concept, I guess, within the social sciences. However, a lot of the funding for the research projects comes from either industry or government, where there is this great big impact delivery, or you need your impact statement, etc., that's in there. In order for us to try and get more social science-led projects against this conundrum of the world of impact being quite difficult, how do we approach that?
So I think this is actually something that the social sciences should deal with. I think they sometimes need to tone down their theory-driven research. And you can still do that while also creating impact. And in fact, I think you can use theory to create better impact. And that link is often not made. So I'll give you an example. If you think about policy interventions, or we just talked about the UK basis for that. Now, policies can have an effect on human behavior, right? We try and change how they behave in a certain way, how much energy they consume. Now, if you understand the theory behind why a policy will or will not have an effect on human behavior, then you can way better design and refine your policies based on that theory. So I'm not saying that theory isn't important. I think it's essential, but you have to make use of that theoretical knowledge to create impact. And I think social scientists don't always make that step because their core interest ends with, I got my theoretical knowledge, but then they need to focus on how do I translate that to impact that is usable for industry, for governments, and that should be very doable.
And I think that kind of that so what, as it were, in terms of, why is this important? Actually, in the natural sciences, people really struggle with that as well. I mean, I'm looking at Aileen, and I'm not going to say that pyrite isn't important because it is. But in terms of taking a body of work, be it a PhD, a postdoc, a much larger consortium of people, and then saying, why is this important? Actually, I think almost all of research struggles sometimes in terms of that. Is that a fair comment, Geertje, or am I being... dismiss
No,
it.
I think you're right, but it's very hard for me to comment on the nuances on natural sciences because, I look from the outside and I see sort of a blur, and vice versa. This is also how social sciences are perceived.
Mm.
So I think in a way we kind of have to understand each other better or respect that we all have similar struggles.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, with that as well, in terms of that respect, um, I mean, many years ago now, Rose and I, we were working with a fantastic social scientist, but the comment that we got was, well, you can't possibly begin to understand what I'm talking about because you're geologists and this is social science work. And it was really interesting because I don't know, I'm looking at Rose now. I think, are we still a little bit angry about that comment? Because we really wanted to engage. We really wanted to engage. So there's almost that element of how do you welcome people in and everybody kind of trying to come and meet one another so that we can speak a language that we can all discuss. And knowing and recognizing where you are alienating somebody, but then also sometimes perhaps we do stomp all over one another's territory and say, well, no, of course I know about this because I'm a human being, and that's all you need to be a social scientist.
Yeah. So, and I think building a research culture when you have time and effort and resources spent on these discussions is really important.
Yeah. Final question, Geertje, and then maybe I'll go to Maeve first just to ask you, Maeve, of any reflections from what we've heard over the course of the last few hours. And this question's come in on the WhatsApp, Geertje, and it's about metrics. So a lot of the metrics that we almost get asked to measure and report on are on that kind of, well, the kind of the numbers side, that quantitative side, which is really, it's difficult in other areas. How do we shift some of these metrics for success and in terms of what we're measuring?
Yeah, good question and difficult. So, especially from a social science perspective, you can't always measure impact in numbers. It's very difficult. And the more you go towards even humanities or the arts, the more difficult it becomes. I would think that maybe what you see commonly in CVs at the moment and that sort of things is write a narrative instead of using metrics. And so I think you can also write a narrative in what potential pathway to impact is there. So if I think about my own work, have I changed the economy directly? No, of course not. Have I changed the opinions in whatever group we're talking about? No, not necessarily directly. Have I made a difference? Yes, I probably have, but it will take time to get there. And I made difference because I actually talked to that policymaker. I spoke at that conference. I planted an idea in someone's head. So I think a narrative around how I tried and achieved some change is the first step.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much for that, Geertje. Another round of applause. Brilliant.